Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Haas Talks Foss. We're here with Henrik Ingo today to talk specifically about his journey in the open source space. He's currently the VP of Engineering in EMEA for Datastax. Before that, he worked at MongoDB, MariaDB, and MySQL. So we're really looking forward to hearing his thoughts on all things open source. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Henrik, it's been a really long time since we've chatted, right? So I think it's been like 4 years.
Maybe more, I think.
Maybe more.
I was at MongoDB 7 years since that's when I left the MySQL community.
Wow. Yes. You were a long time MongoDB user.
Yeah.
Why don't you catch us up? What have you been up to? You know, I know we worked together when we were at MySQL, and then it kind of turned into Sun, and then, Oracle, and then that whole, movement there. But what have you been working on?
So I never worked at Oracle. I was quick enough to be at MariaDB before that happened, but those were still the years. I actually sometimes when I summarize my CV, if I do job interviews, I kind of lump together 5 years of MySQL, even though we ended up having, many of us ended up having many employers during those years. And so MariaDB and fondly remember Galera, and I think that at the end of that, it was actually a week before I started at MongoDB was a Percona Live conference, and of course I was quite active in those when you essentially took over the main MySQL community conference of the year. That was important work, I think, for the community. I'm glad to see it going still, and then I've spent 7 years at MongoDB. I actually was in a Percona Live at London. Maybe we have met there.
Yeah,
2014 maybe.
Yeah, I think we did when you were. I think you were at Mongo and you came to hang out. Yeah,
and that was fun. Somebody else was supposed to give it, and I got cold. And I was just for other reasons in London that time, so I volunteered. I'm happy to go to Percona Live. Sounds like a good conference. I've never been there before.
No, and I mean we're still doing it this year, right? Yeah. So it's coming up.
Yeah.
Shameless plug.
Good.
CFP.
Good. You promised not to do that.
Oh, I did. Well, it's a community thing, right? It's a shameless plug for a community thing.
We'll allow it, but yeah. So I remember two things from that conference. One was it was about schema design in MongoDB, and it was a great session because all the very experienced MySQL guys who basically knew all the other talks already from the conference came to this thing because finally there is something new that they didn't know anything about, and of course schema modeling. In a document database is quite different, and there is a lot of subjective choices. So we had a lot of interesting conversations. I still remember it. The other thing
wait. But wait.
What?
Isn't it schemaless? Everything's schemaless now, right? So you never need a schema.
So I like the word schemaless. Some people think it's like a negative word, but I think it's great. I never enjoyed defining a schema, to be honest. But of course there is still a structure in the JSON document and you need to plan what things go together and so on. But it is more flexible. So actually that's what some people call it, flexible schema or dynamic schema. So you in this work session, I think it was we planned like an e-commerce site, so a document database behind an e-commerce site. So you have some things that are transactional, but then you have some things that are like a product catalog and so on. And then we go through how, and when you had comments, would you store comments as an array into the article, or are they like separate records in the database? In a relational database, it would of course always be separate because you have to normalize. But then in a document database, you can choose. And so you get into these kind of discussions. And I actually, now when I remember it, I did like always giving this session, but it was especially good in a MySQL oriented Percona Live.
Yeah,
this was before This was before you supported MongoDB, by the way. So there were no MongoDB users at the conference. They were just curious to learn about it.
Yeah. No.
The other thing I remember of that time, I was upgraded in the hotel where I was staying for Percona Live, and I was really pissed because I think I was arriving late and I had to go to the session early in the morning. So I was basically staying in the hotel like 6 hours. I felt it was like a bad timing to get a really nice room with an upgrade when I was only staying for a few hours.
Yeah, and I mean that always is a pain because you want to enjoy that perk and you don't get them that often. No. But you had another interesting experience at MongoDB, and I'm going to diverge just a little bit. You actually got the opportunity to onboard one of the great MySQL engineers of our time, right? Mark Callahan, who I saw on your Twitter, like you were kind of his onboarding buddy, or you helped, onboard him. That had to be a weird experience.
Yeah, I think in Twitter I wrote like this week I'm mentoring Mark Callahan in database performance, no less.
Yes.
Or benchmarking MongoDB or something. That was a highlight of MongoDB. It was in the past year, so I was already considering looking at other jobs, but then I heard that Mark was applying for my team, especially because I was on the performance team. So of course I had to stay. We had a lot of fun that year, I think, in the team. There were the two of us and my boss, David Daly. And I certainly, so I would say we had a reasonably good performance practice at that point, and we had a lot of tooling at automated testing, nightly performance tests and analyzing them. And we even published some papers, which we can talk about next. And for which version is it now? 4.4 is the newest one, which came out a year ago almost. I wrote some tests with Sysbench to capture more disk-bound performance issues in the storage engine, and I did. And even when my issues had been fixed, Mark swooped in with his, he kind of brought his own toolkit with him, just adapted it for MongoDB, and he found just more issues. It was quite amazing to see.
Mark is really smart, right? He is really intelligent.
Yeah, but it was certainly a privilege, and we've kept in touch actually since my MySQL days. So there was both a friendship, and of course he's kind of very generous also in mentoring me. To be honest, it was maybe at least as much that way, and also supporting and elevating people he works with. So it was a great time.
Yeah, I have a Mark Callahan story that I'll tell real quick. I remember when I first met him, it was at a NoSQL conference in Portland, Oregon, and he lives in Bend, which is over the mountain, right? So you have to actually go over a mountain to get to Bend, but it's maybe about a 3-hour drive. And he said, hi, and we had known of one another just based on blogs and maybe exchanged some things at different times. But he asked what I was doing. I'm like, I'm going to be here this week, and then I'm going to go to Bend. And he goes, I live over there. And he said, what flight are you on? Maybe we'll be on the same flight. And I go, I'm just going to drive over. And this is October. And he's like, you're going to drive over the pass? And I'm like, yeah, what's the pass? And he's like, is it even open? And I'm like, what do you mean, is it even open? He goes, do you have tire chains for the snow? And I'm like, it's October 1st. What do you mean snow? And he's like, yeah, you might want to check. And he pulled up, I think it was on his phone, a picture, like a webcam picture where the state has cameras along the highway of, different places on the mountain. And they have one of the freeway of the highway, and it was completely white. And he goes, yeah, you're not going to be able to do that probably really easily. He goes, but if you get stuck, I can come on my 4-wheeler and pick you up, I guess. And I'm like, so I actually changed my flight. But yeah, I'll always remember him warning me of the past before I got stuck on a mountain and couldn't get to, where I had to go the next week. So
that was very good of him. I think even in Finland, where we do have snow, maybe in October, I wouldn't have expected it. So I could have done the same mistake, to be honest.
Yeah, it was a 3-hour drive. Why take a plane, right?
Right.
Anyway, so it was a funny thing because he looked at me like, I was crazy. So, but after Mongo, you've moved on to Datastax, and that's where you are now. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it was time for new challenges, and I was also considering maybe doing non-database stuff, but I have a kind of friend from, let's say, blogging and OSCON and other open source circles, Sam Ramji, heard about it, and he was like, Henrik, why aren't you interviewing with database companies? And then I noticed that there have been like a lot of change in Datastax recently, and it's an opportunity to join what we are doing now, and also changed from being an engineer to engineering manager again, which I've done also earlier in my career. So kind of swinging back and forth. Datastax this year has been quite different. So, for example, Datastax is a distributed company, just like the MySQL ecosystem typically companies are. So I feel like I'm more back home, in a working from home setting. Datastax has been doing it for 10 years. It's not related to COVID or anything. We have a lot of engineers, like a third of engineers are around Europe as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Because why not? But it was still an American company. So actually, I'm the first full-time manager in Europe. So previously, previously, we have some really smart engineers across Europe, but they were always reporting to some manager in the US, or like there were team leads in Europe. But so I feel like a lot of the value I bring to the company is just spend time talking with people, because you don't need to have that 4 o'clock meeting, which is the only hour you have together with Silicon Valley people.
It is so important to connect with people, right? Especially in the remote company, to have someone who understands not only the cultural aspects of it, but just to be there.
Yes. So that's like my main job, is to spend time in, especially when I started, I sometimes had like 2-hour one-on-ones if somebody had a lot to talk about. And to understand also more, like not just, which Jira tickets you do today, but people's career aspirations. They want to work on some other aspect of the database and so on. So I do care a lot about that. And then, of course, we have the strategic shift. So in the past year, we've actually gone a bit in the opposite direction compared to many other database companies recently. So Datastax some years ago went into a more closed source strategy, and there were maybe some benefits to it as well, but the current position is that we regret those years, and now we are busy going back to working, and have been for a year working closely upstream with Apache Cassandra. And I'm also leading a project now where we are porting and open sourcing a lot of the work we did in the past 3 years in LSM storage engine and compaction strategy. And one Cassandra enhancement proposal that's already public is a new SAI index type, which is pretty cool. And it's LSM storage engines are known to kind of be good for write-heavy workloads, but actually it turns out it's still a difficult problem to have secondary indexes in an LSM index, because you easily end up doing some kind of read before update or something else which slows you down. And we actually have a really innovative. So I didn't do any of it, but I'm still proud to get to be part of the team and just supervise the open sourcing of these features into Cassandra.
So with the LSM indexing changes, is that something that's going to be applicable to other LSM-based projects? I mean, like for instance, the Rocks storage engine.
Yes, definitely could be. Of course, Cassandra code is Java, so you would have to write it in C++. But I think the way we are doing it is innovative. There is another MySQL person, Kostya, as we know him, Konstantin. I forget his last name. Is it Osipov? Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah. So he in Tarantul they did something similar, which basically is like kind of like lazily. So enable you to do blind writes to secondary index, and of course it's always about trade-offs. So just like LSM, postpones work from the write phase, and you have to do more work in the read phase. In these kind of secondary indexes, it's actually the same. So it just makes the read even more expensive, but it does maintain the good write performance when you update the index. So it is really cool.
And that's why databases are always a trade-off. You have the performance of writes versus the performance of reads, transactions versus analytical workloads. I mean, and I think that's why there's so many different databases now. You have all these little purpose-driven databases that fit a specific workload in a lot of cases.
I sometimes, when I explain this in conference talks and so on, I think a good way to explain it is that actually, for some workloads, database performance is really easy, because if you have a read-only workload, you could just add all the indexes you need, and you would have great performance for any query. And if you have a write-only workload and you never need to read the data back, you could also have great write performance, because you can just kind of write data into a file. And the only problem is when you need both reads and writes, and then you need to start balancing these trade-offs, and that's where you get the database.
I've often said if you just remove all the users, databases would be awesome. Any database would be awesome if you just didn't have any users, right? Like, so fast.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Datastax going through this opening up of a lot of their code. That's the exact opposite of what we are seeing in the industry right now, and from a lot of other companies. What do you think's driving like the opposite trend? Like, I'm really worried about it personally.
To some extent, to be honest, I think it depends on also belief systems. So even if these companies, these decisions are made by board members or CEOs, venture capitalists, or on both sides, and they would like to think they are rational business decision makers, but depending on who is in charge, you go one way or the other. And at Datastax, we are lucky to have people who have worked previously also in companies who were more understood the value of open source and communities much more. Some other companies even say quite clearly that this is just a marketing strategy for us, and we're not doing it. Like, the community isn't doing anything here other than using it.
Yeah.
And so it's a different. People come to these companies with their belief systems, and that kind of sets the direction. I think another thing to remember is so now when we talk about, for example, other database companies, they quite clearly blame one or more public cloud vendors for taking money that they feel belongs to them. And the truth is that it's not an open source specific problem. Like, the world is full of small startups who are getting less money than Amazon and Microsoft and Google, and you can choose whichever license you want. You're never gonna only a few companies ever grow that big and successful. That's just the way the world works. And so I always try to remind people that this has nothing to do with open source. You can look at these other companies; they are struggling as well, because it's hard to have a startup and get customers and grow.
Well, and I think it's interesting. I have some issues on the database as a service side with cloud providers, but I'm going to leave that aside for a second, because I think that the cloud providers and what they've enabled this generation of developers and businesses to do has actually transformed and generated a lot more opportunities for not only database companies, but software companies around the world to be more successful. Like, we have a boom in the number of SaaS companies, the number of technology companies. I mean, you name it. And there's so many people who have been enabled by the cloud. It's kind of like the early days of open source, right? So if there was no LAMP stack, there would be no Facebook, there would be no Twitter, right? Those technologies enabled that. And now having access to, start small and scale up in the cloud has enabled, I think, a new generation of developers. So
it's the same for data centers, I would say. It's like the LAMP stack, but for the whole stack, including the hardware. I remember that was my my few years working with the Galera guys, and that was when I first started using Amazon as well, public cloud, and how transformative it was that, with the credit card, even as a private person, I could have a database cluster on 3 continents. That would have cost like millions just a few years earlier.
My first experience with Amazon was actually with Monty Taylor. So we were doing a consulting gig. I think it was for MTV, like the music television network.
Okay.
We were in California.
Back when they still did music videos.
Yes, back when they still did music. See, like, this is like ancient times, right? And people are like, they did music? What is that? What the M stands for in MTV? No, it's not.
Because YouTube hadn't been invented yet.
Right, YouTube hadn't been invented yet, and so we were there, and they were doing some work with EC2 and one of their game trailer, subsections and websites. And it was like, whoa, what is this? And he's like, oh, it's going to be all the rage. And of course, Monty being Monty, he was very excited about it. And then he took me to a really expensive, fancy dinner afterwards, which is, kind of his thing, right?
That tends to happen.
Yes, with Monty, that tended to happen. But so it's been an evolution for them and all cloud providers, but it really has enabled more revenue for these big companies that are out there than others. So it's an interesting kind of, like, they're dependent on cloud providers, but they also want to blame them.
Yes, it's kind of a very narrow point of view, I would say.
But I think the one thing that I'm most interested in is, how do we continue this innovation, right? So I am worried about, like, the changes to licensing and the changes to some of this. I'm worried that it's going to stifle the innovation around some of the open source projects. So I'm glad to hear that Datastax is opening up more things. I don't have necessarily an issue with proprietary software or open core. I think pure open source is going to win. And that's just my philosophy. But I do have a problem when people kind of fake open source, as I like to say. But I'm really worried that the innovation is going to, kind of start to trickle. You're going to start to see that deadening of that innovation. How can people get involved in contributing to, whether it's Cassandra or some things that maybe Datastax doing, or other open source projects? You've been around this space for a really long time. Where can people get started?
That's a good question to discuss. I should say I'm not that worried personally. We should remember that we are actually living in an age where there is just an endless amount of open source software. I remember when I wrote my book, before I worked for MySQL, I wrote a book about open source, and it's not even very thick. It has like 200 pages or something. But I felt that, like, this book covers the entire open source industry, like, from Red Hat to MySQL to everything. And now, imagine if you'd had to write a book about all the open source that there is. Like, you couldn't do it for a long time. It
requires an Arctic, like, vault where GitHub's going to store all your stuff.
Exactly. That's how big it is. You need to put it in a mountain, even just to cover the code. And so it's kind of natural that when we have so many people trying open source. Some people will also go away, that's not. It's actually mostly happening in the database industry, which is another interesting discussion. But I wouldn't be that worried in general. And then there are companies like Datastax who, to be honest, it was also motivation to work for Datastax, saying that, oh, like you are doing more open source and going in that direction. So maybe I would want to work there. Percona, I know, employs many such people as well, because Percona was always committed to open source as well. So it's not like we don't have those options for those people who feel it's important. So back to your question, how to contribute. Cassandra is a Java ecosystem, like many Apache projects. So it's an Apache project. The good suggestion how to get involved in open source is to work on something you're interested in. So typically, for example, I am now a manager, and recently, some weeks ago, I've launched a small personal open source project on GitHub, which is code to draw graphs from the Jira API. Because okay. That's what engineering managers do, and nobody enjoys it, but it's my job now. So I'm trying to make my life easier by creating better reports and graphs. So which is driven purely from a need I have in my current job, and I'm sharing this code. But sometimes it's good to remember that you don't always need to create new projects. It's actually good to look around first, because maybe somebody else already did the project that you need. You can use it, and then maybe you can add something to it eventually. So I think this is like a good way to start. Which I think is better. It's better to have this kind of motivation rather than saying that I want to become an open source developer, or I would want it to say on my CV that I contributed to some project. So maybe some people do it that way as well, but I've always found it good advice. So from practical point of view, then if you come to Cassandra or some other project, typically if projects are prepared to receive new contributors, they might maintain a list of like low-hanging fruit or good beginner issues. Or I think on GitHub they have some label like good for beginners, and so you should look for those. And in the best case, they might even have people who are actively mentoring newcomers, so to have a good experience. I want to plug. I want to plug a few projects. Cassandra, of course, is the foundational project for Datastax. Was it yesterday, day before yesterday, we announced that we are now also in the Pulsar community. So we've hired some Pulsar committers recently. This is a streaming, an Apache project as well, streaming solution. And then around Cassandra, we actually have some kind of spin-off projects which are separate projects. So K8, K8 like in Kubernetes, so it's our Cassandra distribution for Kubernetes deployments. And we have also a cool new project, Stargate, which is actually based on Cassandra code. So those who know how Cassandra works, there is a coordinator component. So we took the coordinator out. So it's actually now similar to MongoDB architecture or MySQL MDB cluster, where you have separately a front-end node doing the query processing, and then you have a back-end nodes holding the data. So Stargate, in Stargate, we have enabled new HTTP-based APIs, including my favorite, the document API. So now, and I had no idea about this when I joined Datastax. I thought I was leaving the document databases behind. And 7 months later, it's we have a GA release. You can store JSON documents in Cassandra. So that was exciting. I was part of the release day. It was a good day in December. So yeah, those are, if you are interested particularly in projects I'm involved in now, that's like the landscape.
Okay, cool. And one of the things that I think that people don't realize, you mentioned that get involved in something that you care about or that you're passionate about. Sometimes that starts with just blogging or a training or, going to, some event or, doing a video on YouTube.
Documentation is the most valuable contribution you can do. Like if you come to a relatively new open source project and you find there is no documentation, but hey, I figured out how to use this, maybe like by reading source code or past trial or error. So hey, I wrote down what I did, so the next person can actually read my documentation and have an easier time. It's one of the most valuable contributions you can do to open source projects.
And it's really the easiest to get involved with, especially if you're already using the product and you like it.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Henrik, let me leave you with this question. Okay. You've been around the database space for longer than I have. What do you see as,
I'm not sure that's true, by the way.
I think it is. When did you start at MySQL AB?
2008, January. 2 days before the Sun acquisition.
Yeah. I got you beat by like a year. And the open source database space. Okay, so you've been around as long as I have. Okay, let's just say that. Yeah. What do you see now as a trend that like people should take notice of that you think is going to continue to gain popularity in the next year? I mean, is there a project or two, or maybe like the evolution of something that you're starting to see and take notice of?
Yes. As a database user, I think there are a few interesting questions. It's, we are still having these choices between relational database, NoSQL one. Some people are passionate about the SQL language. Some definitely don't want to use it, want alternatives, flexible schema, and so on. I'm in that camp for sure now. I can say it because we offer a solution for it as well.
I'm sure you would say it either way, but
yeah, and also from a scaling point of view, it's interesting. So-called NoSQL based databases nowadays often offer a SQL-like query language, but the relational databases still are very single node. Don't necessarily offer good sharding. Speaking of MySQL and Postgres in particular. So it's surprising that one has evolved to cover the feature set of the other, but the old school database is surprisingly hard to get scalable cloud native architecture, if you will. So those are, I think those are typically what users look for, is scaling, high availability, and the API that you choose for. Maybe in our strategy with Stargate, we're also going from database-specific API to HTTP-based, or maybe in the future some other like gRPC or other standard protocol. The interesting thing, if you use the Stargate APIs, you don't need a database driver at all. So you can just have your app connecting directly to the REST API, let's say, which is Cassandra.
All right. Well, Henrik, anything else you wanted to leave us with? Any final words of wisdom? Anything you want to plug? On Datastax? Feel free.
Yeah, if you happen to be a developer internals of the database, feel free to send me a message. Like I said, we have interesting projects contributing upstream to Cassandra, and then in the query and API layer in Stargate.
Great. Henrik, it was great catching up with you. I appreciate you taking some time on a Friday evening for you.
I still have more Jira work to do today.
Never-ending Jira work.
Yeah. Thanks
right,
for
guys.
contacting me. It was good to catch up.
Yes, indeed. Thanks. Wow, what a great episode that was. We really appreciate you coming and checking it out. We hope that you love open source as much as we do. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to us on the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And of course, tune in to next week's episode. We really appreciate you coming and talking open source with us.